So what's the deal with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor? You got to know that something like that doesn't just come out of nowhere. And so what we want to talk about in this video is why the Japanese take the step to end up attacking Pearl Harbor. And it's traced back in their history to something that we know today as the Rape of Nanking. I'll go ahead and tell you the stories and the images you're going to see are disturbing, but it's a true part of world history, probably something we would know more about if not for the horrors of things like the Holocaust that are going to go on in the European theater of World War II. But nevertheless, you need to understand this to understand why December 7th, 1941 had to happen. So let's check it out. This is Japan. Japan is a set of islands. There are 7 or 8 islands that altogether make up Japan. And so the thing about an island is you're very limited as far as natural resources go. Right? Whatever you have in that small little bit of land is what you've got. So at different times in their history, this had been an advantage for Japan. It had kept them from being attacked in a lot of different ways or a lot of different times. And so it kept them safe. But as the world begins to industrialize, they don't have a lot of the tools that they feel like they need to become a modern country and eventually to expand out to an empire. So by the time the 1930s roll around, Japan is looking for a way to expand. They also felt that Asia should be controlled by Asians or by an Asian country. Now remember, at this time, this is still kind of the tail end of colonialism. So there were places in Asia where the British and the French had colonies. And so they really kind of took offense to the idea that there are these white empires from Europe who are coming over here and telling Asians how to live. It's part of something that will become known as the sphere of influence. These spheres of influence, basically, Japan wanted to split the world into 3 parts. North and South America were going to be under the influence of the United States. And so you can tell right at the beginning, they weren't out to destroy the United States or take us over. They thought that each sphere of the world needed a dominant country, and they were comfortable with the idea of the United States being the dominant country in the American sphere. Their ally, Germany, was going to be the dominant country in the European and African sphere of influence. And then they thought they would be the dominant country in the Asian sphere of influence. Would have been interesting to see what would have happened had those ambitions between Germany and Japan come up against each other in later stages of the war. Fortunately for us, that never happened, but it would have been interesting to see how well they would have gotten along. And so what Japan will do is they start to expand. Now what I've got for you here is a map of the largest the Japanese empire ever got. So this is 1942. Draw your attention back to those islands of Japan there. And you'll see they've taken over quite a bit of the Asian continent. A couple of places I'll point out that will be important to us later on in history. The Korean Peninsula, right there next to Japan. And then French Indochina. If you see that one, just kind of below China there. Later on, that will be the country of Vietnam. And so we'll be involved in wars in both of those places in the 20th century. But this is as big as they got. You can see took over a portion of China, the Philippines when they ran us out of there, and a lot of those places. And again, the idea is when you start to expand, you now have the natural resources that are from those areas. And so you can continue to expand. Also want to draw your attention just to the little islands they've gotten. Probably if you've heard of any of those, the island of Iwo Jima. This there, maybe you've heard there's a famous battle of World War II that's going to happen there. And so what we end up seeing is the strategy is going to be in the Pacific, something called island hopping. We'll talk about that when we look specifically at what's going on there. So what's going to happen is to kind of get this whole ball rolling in the 1930s, Japan will invade China. They invade at a city on the coast called Shanghai. If you've ever seen one of my favorite movies, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, it takes place in Shanghai. No clue if the Club Obi-Wan was still open or not. But the Japanese thought when they invaded China, China was still kind of a backwards country in the world, wasn't nearly as sophisticated as the Japanese. The Japanese had spent a lot of money over the last 50 years or so modernizing their military, and they really felt like this was going to be something that happened very quickly. They thought they were going to take over the entire country of China in 3 months. The Battle of Shanghai takes a month all by itself. They're shocked by the amount of resistance they meet from the Chinese. And to keep that from happening again, to kind of quell that resistance, what the Japanese will do is they look at the next city on the map, a city called Nanking or Nanjing. You see those being used interchangeably as an ancient capital of China. They looked at this as the next city and they said, okay, we're going to make an example out of the city of Nanking. We're going to be so terrible to the people of Nanking that every other city that hears about it is going to be too afraid to fight. And so Nanking is set up for just this horrible attack that's going to happen. Got an image here for you of an infant badly burned after the bombing of the city of Nanking as this started. We've got indiscriminate targeting of the civilian population along with the Chinese military. And again, you want stories of this, horrific stories, to pass on to future towns that Japan may be rolling into, so that these guys aren't going to put up a fight. They don't want any kind of resistance. They would do things like have contests, right? Some of these officers are from the samurai tradition, and so they would have contests where they lined up prisoners, and they would see how quickly they could cut off the heads of the prisoners. Now, what we see here, the three poles that you see there suggest this is the entrance to a Shinto shrine. This would be kind of the same thing as us going to church this weekend and seeing heads hanging above the door of the church, right? That's sending a certain signal about what's going to happen if you resist. A lot of this comes back to this code of the samurai. If you had soldiers who were captured or surrendered to the Japanese army, the Japanese thought that was the most dishonorable thing you could do, and so they considered the life of those people forfeit. And so they end up, like I said, doing these brutal things to these guys that you would see. Some more images here. They're using live targets for bayonet practice in order to kind of tell the most effective way of using that tool, be a knife at the end of a gun. But again, doing this to soldiers who are captured, really going against what we saw with the rules of war presentation. Now, Japan had never signed off on any of those rules, but still the rest of the world's looking and saying, well, wait a minute, right? What's going on here isn't right. They tried to cover up what they'd done by using mass graves. This kind of thing you'll see associated with the Holocaust too in Central Europe, but digging these graves and putting all these bodies out into these graves is one of the pieces of evidence that is found that shows just the extent of what happens in the rape of Nanking. The battle lasts for 6 weeks. There are estimates anywhere between 300 and 600,000 people that die during the rape of Nanking. The only kind of safe zone in the city was an international safety zone that some doctors had set up. They hung that red cross and basically said, if you can get to this section of the city, we're not going to have any combatants here, but this is going to be a safe place. And for whatever reason, the Japanese respected that. And so people that survived, a lot of them were people that were able to get to this international safety zone. The fellow that is responsible for this, General Matsui, will eventually be tried as a war criminal. for what he had done. This starts out as part of the Second Sino-Japanese War, but that war extends into what we know today as World War II. So it just kind of keeps going. The Chinese will be our allies during World War II as we're fighting against the Japanese. The rape of Nanking gets its name obviously from another set of incidents. What would happen is Japanese soldiers would rape Chinese women, sometimes repeatedly, and it was an idea again of dominance, of wanting these stories to get out, so that the ladies in the next town wouldn't want their husbands fighting or putting up any kind of resistance. And so there are hundreds of thousands of cases of rape that will happen. There are horrible stories told, Chinese raping pregnant women and then cutting the children out of the rooms and killing the kid in front of the mom before they killed the mom. I mean, just horrible psychological warfare, really, that's going on. So what's this got to do with Pearl Harbor? Well, when we get word of what's happening, the United States takes steps to try to halt the Japanese advances, not military steps, but economic. We say, hey, well, we're not going to trade with you anymore. We're not going to give you things. And a couple of the big ones, rubber, like for tires, oil, scrap metal that they're using to build these things. Basically said, we're not going to give this to you, and none of our allies are going to give this to you either. And so basically the Japanese have a choice to make. You either give up on this idea of having an empire, or you go all out and say, okay, we've got to take the United States out at least for a little while. And that's what we see at Pearl Harbor. This is kind of them coming over and giving the biggest guy the best punch they've got. They thought, okay, if this buys us a year, we can solidify our control of the Pacific. They won't be able to touch us. Well, they don't really count on how mad the United States is going to be. And so inside of 3 months, the United States is going to start to mount a resistance in the Pacific to the Japanese. But this event, like I said, is what's going to lead to those sanctions, which in turn leads the Japanese to make the decision that they need to attack Pearl Harbor in the Philippines, December 7th, 1941.